Phenomenon of kidfluencers, but this could be seen as a form of child labor. And just as this week, of course, the issue of child labor came into sharp focus at the conference in KwaZulu-Natal. So what is this what is this child slavery in this particular context? Because some saying that kidfluencing is seen as a modern day form of child slavery. So let's have this particular conversation with Gifty Enright, an author, speaker and women in the workplace expert, and advocate Zanyiwe Nthatisi Asare, who's a digital law, regulation and technology consultant. Thank you so much to you both. Good evening. Let's start with kidfluencing. I'm keen here to find out from you, Gifty, what does it all mean? Because when I saw it, I couldn't help but laugh and thinking, influencing children, what's going on? What exactly are parents supposed to be cautious of here? What does it all mean?
So the dangers, as in what it means, they're children in their bedrooms, normally playing, doing whatever it is they're doing. It just happens to be on the internet. And where it becomes dangerous is that the normal dangers of child labor applies here. But when it comes to being on the internet, people don't actually see it as child labor, but it is children working through their childhood. And if they do that, the problem is it robs them of education because it disrupts their education. It robs them of their potential. There's also the exploitation, because the assumption is that the parents that manage these children, they themselves know what to do, and they don't, because there are no legislations actually at the moment governing this side of things. And then there's also the mental health aspect for the children, because, you know, they're robbed of their childhood, and childhood is a very golden period where children get to develop a lot of things that later on gets to serve them. So if they don't have a proper childhood, they're just literally setting themselves up for mental health issues further down the line.
So, advocate, I'm listening to this, and now I don't know, I'm a bit confused, because we saw child stars growing up, and what does this then all mean in the context of child slavery? Because if children are working through their childhood, as Gifty says, and saying that there's alarm bells there, how then do we begin to then define this in the context of child stars as we've known them in South Africa?
So I think she's raised pertinent points around, you know, children being robbed. But from a context of child stars, this has happened. Children have been working for the longest time. If we look at the South African ecosystem or the environment, child labor is strictly prohibited. And the exception to this is that if you get special permission from the labor department for children who are in the performing arts, then it would be permissible, it would be allowed. So we've got that from a traditional perspective, but I think our conversation tonight is more around child influencers, social media and the internet. It's a space that has gone largely ungoverned over the past, you know, the usage, that social usage and commercial usage of the past, 2 decades or so. And that's where now that gap exists, where regulations need to be created, legislation specific to social media. You know, people will say, well, kids are passionate and they'll be doing this stuff anyway in their bedroom, so their parents pop out a camera and put this online. But now there's another argument that says, well, if you're getting paid, it's not play. And I think that's where now regulators need to start looking at that and seeing the terms and conditions of, let's say, these sponsors or these brands that want these children to do specific things. It gets more expensive when money, gets put on the table. Kids are now meant to rehearse. They take, a shoot that's for 1 minute over 2 hours. All those frustrations. And I mean, as my colleague said, in the long run, this does have psychological issues, or rather psychological issues can arise, even physical issues, where this manifests in children.
So I'll get to that psychological aspect in just a moment. I'd like to latch on to something you've said, because really it could be moving from a passion project in the bedroom, as you say, to something that becomes more formalized with brands and all of that. Then I suppose, listening to you, it's going to then be important to then also put that legislation that regulates even the working hours, as you say, because I'd like us to really expand on that, because that is also another contributing factor.
Absolutely. I think what is happening with the internet space is that everything is evolving so quickly that people don't have time or the capacity to just put laws in place. What I believe needs to happen is people need to invest time on these sets. People need to, the regulators, people who work within departments need to invest time to understand when you submit something to YouTube, what are the requirements? And even looking at the revenue that's generated and being able to understand the fuller picture. Once people get that real life experience of what is happening, it will be easier to write laws that are adequate, but not just adequate, would be realistic to implement, because then they'll be targeting real problems on the ground. So for instance, they'll say, well, if it's a child under 5 years old, because that does happen, these are the specific conditions that need to be in place. If it's a child that's X amount of years, this is what needs to happen. They can't work over a certain amount of hours. And because it's an unregulated space, no one is saying anything. And also because parents and guardians are heavily involved, the assumption is that there's a level of care, and sometimes that's not the case.
Gifty, we're talking about the evolution of social media, and you spoke about the issue of mental health as well, because the children become overly involved here. But there's another aspect to it too, which is exposing them to trolls potentially, because that will also become a difficulty when it comes to their mental health issues.
Well, yeah. And so, I mean, we all know of cyberbullying. And so, I mean, what some parents that are managing the children think that they can keep the children away from the pressures of cyberbullying. But I mean, you don't want the child not to have a normal sort of go through their normal teenage years and experience normal puberty, because again, that is the age where they're struggling with their identity, they're trying to find out who they are, they're going through puberty and all the rest of it. And so in those formative years, suddenly, if people are becoming their friends because they're influencers, and if they're measuring their self-esteem by the number of likes they have, how do they work out what their real friends are who are in there because of this new fame that they have? So it's very, very complicated. And the assumption is that every parent that has got a talented child is got the psychological skills and the know-how to manage this child and frame things for them in such a way that it doesn't impact their self-esteem. But that's not true. This is an emergent space, and parents are on a learning curve. And I mean, in the UK, we had MPs asking for child labor and performance laws to be regulated, because what happens is when you're talking about broadcasting, for example, there's strict rules for children. But when it comes to the internet, there are no rules. And so we can't leave it to the parents. We can't have laws for certain aspects of it, because if these children were actually going into a proper workplace, they will have regulations protecting them. Even grown-ups going to proper workplaces have regulations protecting them and their mental health. These kids need that protection as well.
Talking about this issue not being left to parents, Gifty, there's also a concern because of some parents may, find themselves cash-strapped and could use this as a way to earn a quick buck. Would you agree?
I absolutely agree. And no child at 13 years old should be held responsible for their family's mortgage. And that is a pressure that no child needs to endure. Now, every parent obviously sets out with the best intention for their children, but then needs must, right? Now, now there's a cost of living crisis and everything. So parents are forced to make decisions. And when these children start, it's a passion project. But like my colleague said, it is only a passion project until there's a commercial agreement at stake. And then the children come under this pressure. And that is what we really need to protect against.
So, Advocate, listening to what you said earlier and what Gif is saying, because there's really a serious issue here about there being no regulations and almost like seen as anything goes, if I may even put it that way. How then does a parent begin, or even children, or the law begin to then protect, even in the absence of something formal being drafted? How then can parents ensure that their children are not exposed to any kinds of dangers and all of that? Because right now, as you say, there's still this legislation gap that currently exists.
So, Gifty actually mentioned something quite pertinent: the cybersecurity risks, the trolling, effectively cyber crimes that happen at a social level, especially for children. So being able to educate yourself as a parent, ensuring that you understand, if you put your child out there, if you put sufficient information out there, you're actually putting them in danger. So a parent empowering themselves would be the first one, because you can't protect your child if you don't know what to do. The second one would be, the entire ecosystem, society, parents themselves actually going to the sponsors or looking at specific rules and regulations within these platforms that they put to say, well, if you know that it's child-based content, we would like you to put these minimum standards. But that also comes with a level of self-education and, having the confidence to say, based on what I know now, this is what I'd like you to do. But sometimes I think when the money conversation comes in, especially for cash-strapped parents, and I think it's been happening for the longest time, where they actually push children to do certain things, responsible brands from, a public relations perspective would then say, we would not want our children influencers or kid influencers to do certain things or to work certain hours. So those people saying, look, we want to have a good image, and for us to maintain this good name of ours as a parent, please do not go beyond X, Y, Z. So just really having a responsible society that we live in. We are Africans at the end of the day, I guess, from the context that we're speaking, and they say it takes a village. And I think at this point in time, we need to understand that our village also does expand to the cyberspace.
I'd like to thank you both for your time, because this, I do hope, has given parents some kind of caution to not take things lightly when it comes to this issue of kidfluencing. But thank you so much to you both.